There is a sentence that makes software projects sound smaller than they really are. In this case, the sentence was, we already have DocuSign. We just need to upload the forms. That sounds harmless. It sounds practical. It sounds like a simple e-signature project. But underneath that sentence were 25 field reps, 35 different consent forms, multiple insurance scenarios, many different language requirements, legal representatives signing versus the patient, in-person signing versus digital signing, Salesforce status tracking, and a paper process that has been carrying the business rules for years. The signature was not the workflow. The signature was just the visible part. And this is where a lot of Salesforce and operations projects get misscoped. Because the visible task sounds simple. Get the form signed. Add DocuSign. Stop using paper. Make this digital. But the real project is not always the thing that people can see. The real project is the workflow around the thing that people can see. And if you only design for the visible task, the process will still break. If you are a business leader, this is the trap that I want you to watch out for. A project gets described too narrowly. Someone says, we just need signatures. Or we already have DocuSign. We just need to connect it. Or this should be simple. It's just forms. And because the project sounds simple, the scope gets treated as simple as plugging in a toaster oven. The budget gets framed as simple. The timeline gets framed as simple. The internal patience for complexity gets very, very low. Then the team starts working through the actual process, and suddenly that simple project is asking questions that nobody answered. Which forms apply to the same process? Which packet of forms get used in certain scenarios? Who is the person expected to sign these documents? What if the signer is not the patient? What if the signer doesn't have an email address? What if, instead of the patient, it's a legal representative who's not even listed in Salesforce? What data should be pre-filled from Salesforce into the form? What data should be coming back from the form into Salesforce? Who needs to see the signed document? What status should get updated when the document is sent, when it's viewed, if it's rejected, if it's signed by signer 1, not signer 2? What does legal need to verify? What does headquarters need to track? And now leadership starts wondering, why is this project taking so long? Why did this get complicated? Is the team over-engineering this? Is this scope creep? Maybe, but often it's not scope creep. Often it is the real workflow finally becoming visible. Here was the visible problem with this project. The healthcare company had a patient consent process that was still paper heavy. 25 field reps were involved. Those reps had to carry physical consent packets into the field. And these were not one-size-fits-all forms. The correct packet would depend on the insurance company, the insurance plan they were on, who was paying for the services, what language does the signer speak, what type of signer is signing the document, who was the referral source, and all sorts of other details. So the field rep was not just carrying paper. The field rep was carrying decision logic. They needed to know which packet applied. They needed to handle the signing situation that was in front of them. They needed to collect the signed paperwork. And then those signed forms had to get back to headquarters for filing and storage. And because the process depended on physical documents moving through the world, forms could be delayed, misplaced, or lost. That creates an operational problem. But in healthcare, it also creates a visibility and an audit trail problem. Leadership cannot easily see what has been signed. Legal cannot easily verify the completed process. Headquarters is now waiting on paper to come back. Salesforce is not the immediate source of truth, and the business is paying for DocuSign while the real process depends on paper. That is the contradiction. They had the tool, but they did not yet have the workflow. The false diagnosis was understandable. We already have DocuSign. We just need to upload the forms. That sounds reasonable. If the problem was we need signatures, then an e-signature tool sounds like the right answer. And to be fair, DocuSign can absolutely capture digital signatures. That is not the issue. The issue is that the business did not only need signatures, it needed a compliance-sensitive signing workflow connected to Salesforce. It needed a complex decision logic automatically baked into Salesforce behind the scenes so that their employees didn't have to go through a whole decision tree to figure out which version of the form gets used in this kind of a situation. And on top of that, it needed a compliance-sensitive signing workflow that was actually connected to Salesforce. And those are very different problems. If you define the problem as we need signatures, then the fix sounds like upload the PDFs, create a new template, add a button, send the envelope, done. But if you define the problem as we need the right consent packet signed by the right person under the right conditions with the right data, visible to the right people, tracked in the right system, now you are no longer talking about a simple signature project. You are talking about workflow design. And that is where a lot of projects get misscoped. Not because people are careless, because the visible task looks much smaller than the real operating process underneath it. Here is the key idea. The paper forms were not just paper. They were business rules disguised as paper. They answered questions the system did not yet know how to answer. Questions like, which forms apply to this patient? Which insurance company or plan changes the packet? Which payer matters? Which language is required for this situation? In this situation, is the patient signing? Is it a legal representative? Do we have an email address for the person who's signing the document? And if it's a legal representative who's doing the signing, is that person already in Salesforce? Which fields should Salesforce pre-fill into the document? Which fields does the signer need to complete at the time of signing? Which values need to come back into Salesforce? How should the status be tracked at every step along the way? Where should the signed document be visible? How does legal know that the right thing happened? That is not just upload the forms. That is process logic. And before the implementation, much of that logic lived in paper packets, staff memory, manual, judgment, and physical handoffs. So when someone says, why is this DocuSign project so complicated? The answer might be because DocuSign is not the complicated part. The process you are asking DocuSign to support is complicated, and the tool is forcing that complexity out into the open. The real diagnosis was this. The company did not have a DocuSign problem. It had a workflow design problem hiding inside a paper consent process. The business had already bought the e-signature tool, but the process had not been translated into Salesforce. That translation matters because software cannot reliably run a workflow the business has not yet even defined. It cannot automatically know which document packet applies. It cannot automatically know the appropriate signer scenario. It cannot automatically know which language is needed. It cannot automatically know which Salesforce fields should pre-fill the document. It cannot automatically know what legal needs to see afterwards. It cannot automatically know which status updates are relevant. Those decisions have to be designed. And if they're not designed, the team is left with a very dangerous version of digital transformation. The surface becomes digital, but the operating logic remains manual. You get electronic signatures, but still rely on people to choose the right form. You get a button, but not a process. You get a signed PDF, but not trusted visibility. You get software activity, but not operational clarity. And that is where business leaders can get fooled, because it looks like the tool has been implemented, but the business process has not actually been rebuilt. A generic version of this project might have been add a DocuSign button in Salesforce, attach the forms, let the field rep send them, and move on. But that would have digitized the surface while preserving the confusion. The field rep would still need to know which documents to choose. The system might still fail when the signer was not a patient. The workflow might still break when a legal representative was involved. The process might still assume email-based signing when the real-world situation required in-person signing by someone who doesn't have an email address. Salesforce might still lack reliable status tracking. Headquarters might still lack immediate visibility. Legal might still lack confidence in the audit trail. That is the risk with simple software fixes. They can make a broken process faster without making it safer. They can make the interface look cleaner while the operating model is still fragile. They can reduce one type of friction while preserving the deeper source of confusion. And then when the project disappoints, people blame the tool or the admin or the users or adoption. But sometimes the tool did exactly what it was configured to do. The problem is that nobody had fully defined what the business needed it to do. So what had to be designed in this situation? First, document selection. The system needed to understand which forms applied based on the situation. The insurance company, the insurance plan, the payer, the language, the referral source, the signer scenario. Those are not cosmetic details. Those are the underlying core logic options involved in this process. Second, signer handling. Not every signature scenario is the clean, easy version. Some patients might sign in person. Some might not have an email address. Sometimes a legal representative signs. Sometimes that legal representative is not a contact in Salesforce and doesn't have to be. If your digital process only supports the ideal scenario, your field team will immediately create a workaround for the real scenario. And that workaround might be paper. Third, data movement. Which data should Salesforce pre-fill into the form when it gets sent out? Which fields is the signer expected to complete? Which values from the form should be tracked afterward? Which status updates matter? If data flows aren't designed clearly, the signing tool becomes disconnected from the system of record. Fourth, visibility. Once the document is signed, who needs to know? Where does the signed document live? How quickly can headquarters see it? How can legal verify the process? What does Salesforce show? Because the business value here was not merely someone signed electronically. The value was that signed documents became visible immediately through a Salesforce connected workflow. That is a much stronger outcome than we uploaded the forms. The completed implementation turned the paper-heavy consent process into a Salesforce-connected DocuSign workflow. 35 forms and templates were digitized and configured. 25 field reps were supported. The process supported in-person signing. It supported legal representative signing. It added or updated DocuSign buttons in Salesforce. It configured patient consent templates. It built dynamic template selection logic. It added Salesforce status tracking from DocuSign actions. It handled referral source merge logic. It configured the signer input fields, and it made signed documents visible immediately after completion. And that last point matters because in the old process, the business was dependent on signed paper packets physically making their way back to headquarters. There was a delay between the form was signed and the business can see and verify that the form was signed. After the workflow was connected, that visibility became immediate. That is not just a convenience improvement. That changes the operating posture. Field reps have a clearer process. Headquarters has better visibility. Legal has a stronger audit trail. And Salesforce becomes more of the operational hub it was supposed to be. Now, here's the bigger lesson. When a project like this expands, leaders often interpret it as scope creep. And sometimes, yes, it is. Sometimes teams add unnecessary complexity. Sometimes people overbuild. Sometimes the implementation drifts far away from the actual business need. But sometimes what looks like scope creep is actually scope discovery. The business thought the project was get signatures digitally. But the real project was model a compliance-sensitive consent workflow inside Salesforce and DocuSign so that field reps, headquarters, and legal can all trust the process. Those are not the same project. And if leadership approves the first project, but the business actually needs the second, frustration is almost guaranteed. The implementation team looks slow. The admin looks buried. The vendor looks expensive. The timeline looks suspicious. The business leader wonders why a simple request became a 6-month process. But the better diagnostic question is, was it ever simple? Or did the simplicity only exist because the manual process was hiding the complexity? That is the uncomfortable truth. Paper hides complexity. Spreadsheets hide complexity. Email chains hide complexity. Staff judgment hides complexity. Manual workarounds hide complexity. Then when you try to move the process into Salesforce, DocuSign, automation, or AI, all of that hidden logic has to become explicit. And that is the moment the business says, why is this so complicated? Because now the system has to know what only the people used to know. That is also where the person expected to make it work gets trapped, because that person is usually the Salesforce admin. Leadership says, we just need this DocuSign process set up. But the person doing the work quickly discovers that the request is incomplete. This is not as easy as plugging in a microwave. They need decisions, they need rules, they need exception handling, they need clarity on business ownership, they need legal input, they need field rep reality, they need Salesforce data quality, they need to know what should happen when the easy scenario is not the scenario in front of them. And if they ask too many questions, they can look like they are slowing the project down. And if they do not ask enough questions, they build a fragile process that nobody can use. That is the trap. The person closest to the implementation is often the first one to see that the original diagnosis was way too small and unrealistic. But they might not have the authority to redefine the project. So they are expected to make the tool work inside of a workflow that the business has not fully named yet. That is not a technology problem. That is an operating model problem. So how do you catch this earlier? Before you call a project simple, ask what workflow surrounds the visible task. If the visible task is get a signature, ask what happens before the signature. How does the team know which document applies? Who decides? What data does the document need before it's signed? Where does that data come from? What exceptions happen in the real world? What happens if the ideal signer is not available or not even known? What happens after the signature is captured? Who needs visibility? What system becomes the source of truth? What status needs to get updated? What proof does the business need later? Those questions are not bureaucracy. They are how you prevent a shallow implementation. Because if you skip them, the team still answers them. They just answer them later, under pressure, during testing, after the launch, in workarounds, in Slack messages, in emergency fixes, in field rep complaints, in legal escalations, in why isn't this showing up in Salesforce meetings? That is always more expensive. Here is the decision test I would use. If your team says, we just need to add DocuSign, ask, could a new person follow the process correctly without asking a veteran employee what to do? If the answer is no, you do not just have a DocuSign setup project. You have undocumented workflow logic. Here's another test. Does Salesforce know enough to guide the process? If the answer is no, then the signing tool is only one piece of the work. Here's another test. After the document is signed, can the business immediately see what happened, trust it, and act on it? If the answer is no, then you may have captured a signature without creating operational visibility. And one more. What are the real-world exceptions? Not just the happy path, the exceptions. You don't have an email address for the person who's signing. There's an alternate signer that you never knew of. The document goes out in the wrong language. You have multiple packet options. You're missing Salesforce data that's needed in the document. If your design does not handle the real-world exceptions, the users will. And they will usually handle them outside of the system. That is how paper comes back. That is how spreadsheets come back. That is how manual follow-ups come back. Not because people hate technology, because the official process does not match reality. That is why Salesforce ROI so often disappoints business leaders. The business buys tools expecting clarity, but the tools expose the business's ambiguity. They expose the business's unclear ownership. They expose the business's undocumented logic. They expose the business's messy handoffs. They expose business rules that only live in people's heads. And if leadership interprets that exposure As a technology failure, they will prescribe the wrong fix. They will say Salesforce is too complicated, DocuSign is not working, the admin is overbuilding, the users are reluctant to use it, we need a different tool. But maybe the tool is showing you something useful. Maybe it's showing you that the process was never as defined as people believed. In this case, DocuSign was not missing, Salesforce was not missing, the workflow was missing. Or more precisely, the workflow existed, but it existed in paper, in memory, and in manual judgment. The implementation had to move that workflow into the system. That is where the ROI came from. Not from the signature itself, from making the workflow visible, guided, trackable, and connected to the system of record. So the executive takeaway is this: a digital signature is not the same thing as a digital process. Buying DocuSign does not make the process digital. Uploading PDFs does not make the process reliable. Adding a button in Salesforce does not make Salesforce the source of truth. The ROI appears when the workflow, the business rules, the signer scenarios, the data movement, and visibility are all connected. If your team still prints, carries, files, chases, or manually reconciles documents after buying an e-signature tool, do not start by blaming the users. Do not start by blaming the Salesforce admin. Do not start by blaming the tool. Start with the workflow. Ask, what is the signature sitting inside of? What decisions happen before the signature is captured? What proof is needed after the signature is captured? What exceptions does the business actually face in the real world? What should Salesforce know or guide or track and reveal to the people using it? Because the signature might be the easy part. The workflow is usually where the real business problem lives. If your organization is debating whether a Salesforce or DocuSign project should be simple, slow the conversation down before you commit to the scope. Ask what process the tool is actually being asked to carry. Ask where the business rules live today. Ask what happens in the exceptions. Ask what evidence the business needs when the meeting gets serious. Because sometimes the problem is not that the project became too complicated. Sometimes the problem is that the original definition was too small. And if you want more breakdowns like this, real Salesforce and operations stories where the visible problem was not the real problem, this is the kind of diagnosis we do here. No panic, no blame theater, no generic consulting fog. Just better questions before the business spends more money fixing the wrong thing.